Good morning, children. Today we are going to start first lesson of your supplementary reader. The name of lesson is A Triumph of Surgery. This is triumph is victory of surgery. Tricky, a small dog. You should remember this name. This is a story of a small dog. His name is Tricky. Is pampered and overfed by his rich mistress. Pampered is a word used for love, but this love is different. The product of this love is very bad. जिसको प्यार से बिगाड़ना कहते हैं. Tricky is a small dog, is pampered and overfed by his rich mistress. He falls seriously ill. Means Tricky falls seriously ill and his mistress consults a veterinary surgeon, a surgeon or a doctor who treats the animals. Does by he perform an operation? Does the dog recover? This is the question. You should keep these questions in your mind. Why is Mrs. Pumphrey worried about Tricky? Mrs. Pumphrey is rich mistress of the dog. Name of dog is Tricky. What does she do to help him? Is she wise in this? Third question. Who does I refer to in this story? I was really worried about Tricky this time. It means the writer. I is the writer of this story. That is why he has used the word I for himself. Now, see the line. I was really worried about Ricky this time. I had pulled up my car when I saw him in the street with his mistress, and I was shocked at his appearance. He had become hugely fat, like a bloated sausage, that is, like a swollen sausage with a leg at each corner, his eyes bloodshot and rheumy. Rheumy is discharge of water. Stared straight ahead, and his tongue lolled from his jaws. Lolled is came out. His tongue came out from his jaws. This is the description of Tricky. Mrs. Pumphrey hastened to explain to the doctor. He was so listless, Mr. Harriet. Write in your copy the name of doctor Our veterinary doctor is Mr. Harriet. So Mrs. Pumphrey is telling to the doctor, Mr. Harriet, see this? He was so listless, Mr. Harriet. He seemed to have no energy. I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition. So I have been giving him some little extras between meals to build him up. Some malt and cod liver oil and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. Nothing much really. Dear children, you see a list of very nutritious food which was given by Mrs. Pumphrey to her dog. And did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you? Oh, I did for a bit, but he seemed to be so weak. I had to relent. Means go back. He does love cream cakes, and chocolate, so I cannot bear to refuse him. I looked down again at the little dog. That was the trouble. Tricky's only fault was greed. Means Tricky was a greedy dog. He had never been known to refuse food. He would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night. And I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pumphrey had not mentioned. Are you giving him plenty of exercise? Asked the doctor. Well, he has his little walks with me, as you can see. But Hodgkin, the gardener, has been down with lumbago. Lumbago is joint pain. Means gardener was suffering from joint pain. So there has been no ring throwing lately. Ring throwing is a kind of exercise for the dog. So it has been stopped these days. I try to sound severe. Severe is harsh. Now, I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right down and give him more exercise, he is going to be really ill. You must harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet, suggested the doctor to Mrs. Pumphrey. Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hands. Oh, I will, Mr. Harriet. I am sure you are right, but it is so difficult, so very difficult. She set off, head down along the road as if determined to put the new regime into practice immediately. I watched their progress with growing concern. Tricky was tottering, means walking weakly, along in his little tweed coat. Tweed is woolen coat. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats for the cold weather and a raincoat for the wet days. He struggled on, drooping in his harness. I thought it would not be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. The expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught, means extremely worried. Tricky would eat nothing, refused even his favorite dishes, and besides, he had bouts of vomiting. Bouts is attacks of vomiting. He has spent all his time lying on a rug, painting, did not want to go for walks, did not want to do anything. I had made my plans in advance. The only way was to get Ricky out of the house for a period. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight to be kept under observation. You can say it. The doctor suggested for a fortnight hospitalization of Tricky. So, observation means procedure of treatment. The poor lady almost soon is became unconscious. She was sure he would pine and die if he did not see her every day. But I took a firm line. Tricky was very ill, and this was the only way to save him. In fact, I thought it best to take him without delay, and followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailings. I marched out to the car carrying the little dog wrapped in a blanket. The entire staff was roused and made rushed in and out, bringing his day bed, his night bed, favorite cushions, toys, and rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl, realizing that my car would never hold all the stuff. I started to drive away. As I moved off, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing cry, threw an armful of the little coats through the window. I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. Everybody was in tears. Out on the road, I glanced down at the pathetic little animal gasping on the seat by my side. I patted the head, and Ricky made a brave effort to wag his to move his tail. Poor old lad, I said, you have not a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you. Now, next questions are very important. Keep in your mind. In the Is the narrator as rich as Tricky's mistress? How does he treat the dog? Why is he tempted to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest? Why does Mrs. Pumphrey think the dog's recovery is a triumph of surgery? At the surgery, the household dogs surged around me. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes and, when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. The other dogs, after sniffing round him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. Means there were many dogs in the hospital of Mr. Harriet, and after sniffing or smelling the dog, other dogs thought that uh, Tricky was an uninteresting object, and the dogs ignored Tricky. I made up a bed for him means for Tricky, in a warm loose box next to the one where the other dog slept. For 2 days I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third, he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. Whimper is giving out sound. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed. Engulfed is engaged by Zoo, the greyhound. This is a kind of dog. Its name was Zoo. And his friends, after rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. There was the unusual headlong rush, followed by the sounds of high speed eating. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. You can see in the picture how the dogs are eating, and the doctor is observing the dogs, especially Tricky. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk round the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. Jostling is pulling and pushing. From then on, his progress was rapid. He had no medicinal treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly screamings. Screamings is confused struggle. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, tramped on, and squashed every few minutes. He became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely silky little object among the Shaggy crew. Shaggy is full of hair, fighting like a tiger for his share at meal times and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. He had never had such a time in his life. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins, means news about the dog. I dodged the questions about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather. But I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. Convalescing is recovering rapidly, I told. The word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. She started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up Tricky's strength for a happy period. My partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast, but when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. Means Pumphrey, Mrs. Pumphrey started to bring dozens of eggs and bottles of wine, which was liked by the people of hospital. Doctor also liked, but in reality, these things were not given to Tricky. It was to enrich Tricky's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. We could hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution. For a few nights, the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drunk. Reverently is respectively drunk. They were days of deep content, starting well with the extra egg in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and finishing luxuriously round the fire with the brandy. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest, but I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering and after a fortnight felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. In these lines, Doctor told Mrs. Pumphrey that she can. collect her dog after a fortnight. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. The chauffeur opened the door, and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey, almost lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. Oh, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is he really better? Yes, he is fine. Who is fine? Tricky is fine. There is no need for you to get out of the car. I will go and fetch him. Fetch him means bring him. I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was the little golden figure of Tricky. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe, hard muscled animal. He was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. Tricky was so fat that his chest was brushing the ground. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms in a tremendous leap. Tremendous is great leap, and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She gave a startled oh and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her. Swarmed is climbed over her, licking her face and barking. During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats, and bowls, none of which had been used. All these things were related to Tricky, which was sent by her mistress to the hospital. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window, tears shone in her eyes. Her lips trembled. Oh, Mr. Harriet, she cried, how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery. Dear children, you listen this lesson again and again. You read this lesson again and again so that you may understand this lesson. Thank you.